Now, cherry picking is the practice of ignoring or dismissing relevant passages that oppose a point you're trying to make or a doctrine you're trying to defend, and only using verses that appear to support your position. So take predestination versus free will, for example. The disagreement here is essentially between whether God has given us free will to choose to follow him, or if he predetermined we would before we were even born. Now, predestination, or predetermination as the MJLT puts it, is explicitly taught by Paul. For instance, Ephesians 1:5 says, "He has predetermined us to the adoption as sons through Yeshua the Messiah to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will." Paul also says in Romans 8:29 through 30, "Those whom he foreknew, he also predetermined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And those whom he predetermined, he also called and declared righteous and glorified." So that's pretty straightforward. It's God's will to predetermine whether we will be called, adopted as sons, and conformed to Yeshua's image. So if we simply stop here with Paul and cherry pick these verses, we could then conclude that the only way we can come to follow God is because he predetermines that for us. So what do we do then with Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 through 20, where Moses says, "To choose life so that you will live, to love Adonai your God, to listen to his voice, and to stick close to him, for he is your life and the length of your days." So Moses says to choose to love God. But are we really free to make that choice? Moses seems to think so. I mean, why the exhortation if it's already a foregone conclusion? But if it's our choice whether or not to love God, how does that square with Paul? Well, if you're dead set on predestination only, then you might suggest that you were predestined to make that choice. But I'm pretty sure a predetermined choice is an oxymoron. And you don't want to be an oxymoron, do you? Now, I'll grant that the free will concept in Scripture is more assumed than stated, unlike predetermination. And it's just as easy to be myopic about this subject when you're coming from the free will only side of it. But that doesn't change the fact that there are plenty of verses which indicate that we have the choice whether or not to follow God and be saved. The only way you can get to a theology that says it's completely out of our hands or it's only in our hands is to cherry pick your supporting verses. The fact of the matter is, Scripture demonstrates a tension between God's predetermination and man's will, making it far more complex than a simple either-or proposition. And this tension is perfectly encapsulated in John 6:44, where Yeshua says, "No one is able to come to me if the Father who sent me does not draw him." And in Yaakov, James 4:8, where he says, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." So no one is able to come to God unless God draws him. But if you draw near to God, he will draw near to you. So assuming that both of these statements are true, which they are, then who draws first? Does God making us able to come to him mean that he's making us unable to resist him? Or does it just make it possible? Is there a definitive order of events? Or is it that one thing simply can't happen without the other? Or perhaps more to the point, is the entire question moot? Since according to Scripture, there will never be a salvation in which God chooses us, but we don't also choose him. Now, my goal here isn't to get to the bottom of the debate, because frankly, if we're not cherry picking, it ought to be obvious that God simultaneously predetermines and allows us the freedom to choose him. It's both equally. That's the only way to reconcile verses like these without doing a bunch of philosophical gymnastics. And while that may be intellectually unsatisfying to you, that doesn't make it any less true. So the debate itself of whether it's only predestination or only free will really isn't important. What's important is to not cherry pick the verses that seem to so obviously support your own beliefs, and then to ignore or reinterpret the opposing verses based on the theology you've built or accepted as a result of cherry picking.